Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Alumni Virtual Speaker Series. I'm Paul Clifford. We are going to be getting started in just a minute or two. Go ahead and let us know who you are and where you're zooming in from today. You can put that information in the chat. We have a great program lined up for you today. We're going to visit with Dr. Nichola Gutgold. She's a professor of communications, arts and sciences at Penn State Lehigh Valley, has done some great work with women in politics and has a great presentation to share with you all today. We are going to get started in just a minute or two. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session, which is being recorded. Live closed captions are available for this event. You can access them by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom video window, and then clicking Show Subtitle. You may also customize your caption view by clicking the Stream to Text link posted in the chat. This afternoon, we welcome Nichola Gutgold, Professor of Communications, Arts and Sciences at Penn State Lehigh Valley. When Madam President finally moves into the Oval Office, she will have many people to thank her, her supporters, her first gentleman, if she has one, but most of all, she will have the women who have run for president before her. This talk shares the 20 plus years of research and publications on electing Madam President and what it might take to do just that. In addition to serving as a professor of communications, arts, and sciences at Penn State Lehigh Valley, Nichola is an internationally recognized scholar on rhetoric of women trailblazers. She's the author, co-author, or editor of more than 8 books and several children's books based on her research. Today, Dr. Gutgold is going to take us through her presentation. She has received numerous awards for teaching and research, including the 2018 Penn State Alumni Fellow Teaching Award, the Lehigh Valley Women of Influence Award, and the 2016 Teaching Fellow Award from Penn State University College. She is also an Alumni Achievement Award recipient for professional excellence from King's College. Thank you for joining us today, Nikki. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Hello, everyone. It's just a big honor to be here today. I'm not, as Paul said, just a professor at Penn State. I'm also an alumna. So this really means a lot to me to be here. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, and I already have seen some wonderful questions. So thank you already for being so engaged in this presentation. And I want to make sure that I have enabled the media, which I don't know if that happened yet, but let's roll and see how it goes. So I titled this presentation, Paving the Way for Madam President. And I have a question. When we think of the President of the United States, what do we, and also children in our country, think of? And maybe even around the world, what do they think of, and what do they picture when we say President of the United States? The likelihood is that they picture exactly what you're looking at on the screen right now. They picture all of these men who have served as president of the United States, and mostly white men, with the exception of one. And what my research is about is changing that rhetoric, making the thought of what we think of when we hear the title President of the United States inclusive also of women. And it usually surprises people when they discover or find out that over 100 women have run for president of the United States. And that's what my research focuses on. I like to remind people of some of the women from the past and some of the women from the fairly recent time who have run for president of the United States. So we may have read in history books about Victoria Woodhull. She is known to be the very first woman who ran for president of the United States. But there have been so many other women, often women who are forgotten about, who have run for president. I'd like to refresh our memory. And the reason this research is important, the reason that it's exciting to discover the names and the faces of these women is because when we realize that other women have tried something, the likelihood that additional women will run for political office is much more likely. So when women run, they win, not all the time, but as we'll discover through this presentation, is that they make incremental gains that eventually will result in a woman becoming president. The problem is if we forget, if the public forgets that they have ever run, it won't really matter because less women will be inspired by their efforts. And there are other issues too, which I'll touch upon. But if when women run for political office, it's such a rough endeavor, it may discourage future women from running. So a lot of research supports this claim that women running promotes more women in political office, including shamelessly my own research. So when we elect Madam President, what happens in the United States? Well, these women that we're going to be talking about today will have in large part been responsible for making it happen because they have paved the way, because they have helped to change the narrative, and they have helped to change the rhetoric of women who run for political office. And that's what my work is about. I am not a political scientist. So even though I have read many studies about other countries that have elected women more frequently, that's not my particular area. My particular area is rhetoric. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is an invitation to see the world through the rhetor's eyes. It's designed to generate understanding among individuals with differing perspectives. It's examining women's presidential experiences. We begin to see the world of presidential politics through a woman's eyes. And as Aristotle very famously said, rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So when I look at the bids of the women who've run for president, I keep these things in mind and I take a rhetorical approach and I try to describe and examine their bids for the presidency in a rhetorical way. So here's a woman, Margaret Chase Smith. And when we think about some of the women historically who have run for president, they came in dribs and drabs throughout a number of years. So for example, in 1964, Margaret Chase Smith, who was a Republican senator from Maine, made a bid for the United States presidency. And when we think about Margaret Chase Smith and we learn about her, we realize she was a woman with a high school education. She was the only woman in the Senate for a long time. And she was really very reluctant to become a presidential candidate. In fact, she was known as, quote, the quiet woman, because she very rarely spoke out because she felt like she didn't have something she wanted to contribute until she did. And she made a very famous speech on the floor of the Senate against McCarthyism. And she was one of the only senators who was willing to speak out against it. But when she ran for president of the United States, there she is at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. She said what is really about all of the research I do, quote, I would be pioneering the way for a woman in the future to make her more acceptable, to make the way easier for her to be elected president of the United States. So the idea that her bid would be a way to change the narrative of what a president looks like was not lost on Margaret Chase Smith. In fact, it almost sounds like she knew she couldn't win, that she was doing it to make it easier for future women. Now, this is Shirley Chisholm, and in 1972, Congresswoman Chisholm became a candidate for president of the United States. And I'd like to play this clip.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America. I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman and I'm equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or fat cats or special interests.
Her slogan was that she was unbought and unbossed. And she spoke later. You see a few clips. If you go onto YouTube, you can find some clips of her in her later years talking about how she knew she wasn't going to win. So a little bit like Margaret Chase Smith before her. She said, as a Black woman, when she would enter in a room and say that she is running for president of the United States, she said, quote, people looked at me like I was half crazy. And yet she persevered. In 1988, Pat Schroeder became an unlikely candidate for president of the United States when the candidate that she was running a campaign for, Gary Hart, quickly dropped out of the race when his infidelity was discovered. And her rhetoric, she's a Colorado congresswoman who had a real silver tongue. She coined the phrase, Ronald Reagan is, quote, the Teflon president. Nothing ever sticks to him. But she offered this very common sense approach to Americans. And she compared the United States' life for families to life for families in European countries, in particular Germany. And she talked about how long women get maternity leave, and how both the husband and the wife are able to participate in child rearing. And that's the kind of approach she took to her presidential campaign. But she dropped out not long after she started running. And part of the reason was financial. She got in late. And when she dropped out of the race, she cried because she felt very emotional, as any of us might. But she was cast as a very weak person. And a lot of the press said, this is what happens when women run for political office. They're too weak. They will cry. You know, so the temperament of women was called into question because Pat Schroeder cried. In the year 2000, Elizabeth Dole ran for president of the United States in a very crowded field. If you recall, it was George W. Bush, Stephen Forbes was running. They had large personal fortunes to put into the races. And Elizabeth Dole was most known for her absolutely blockbuster speech at the 1996 Republican National Convention when, as the spouse of Bob Dole, she literally brought the house down when she walked around the convention floor and told stories of her husband who really needed the PR boost from someone who knew him best, because at the time, Time magazine described him as, quote, the nation's mortician. So she had absolutely blockbuster, eloquent public speaking skills. And she had a beautiful record, Harvard law graduate. She was Secretary of Transportation, first woman ever, Secretary of Labor, only second to Frances Perkins before her. And yet, article after article described her as, quote, not having held any political office previously. And we know we have elected someone who never held political office previously. But for a woman, it is not an option, according to research that I've done and others as well. A deeply religious woman, a lot of her rhetoric had a Christian focus to it. In 2004, Carol Moseley Braun, it's a little blurry in the photo, but you see her in the center wearing a red suit, and she's flanked by the men in what I call the male political costume, which is a dark suit, a blue or red tie, done. She described herself as a fiscal hawk and a peace dove. She was not in the race very long. She had a lot of financial trouble and a lot of bad press. Of course, in 2016, Hillary Clinton got closer than any woman ever in the United States to presidential possibilities as the nominee of the Democratic Party. I'm going to play a little clip from the convention in Philadelphia. I was there with some students. It was a pretty exciting historical moment. Okay, that was Rachel Platten, the fight song, can't get it out of my head. It was such a good, really kind of a, historical moment. And we know a lot of the rhetoric about this race. I'm going to read a little bit from my book real quick on this. The lessons from 2016 and other women who have blazed trails remain highly instructive. Hillary Clinton's bid for the presidency in both 2008 and 2016 represented the first time in U.S. history that a woman was not a symbolic presidential candidate. In 2008, she came close to clinching the Democratic nomination, ultimately won by Barack Obama. And in 2016, she won the Democratic nomination for president. We know this history, but do we know where it has led us? And that's really what my research in this latest book, Electing Madam Vice President, is all about. Does 2016 mean anything to women's political future? And what in the world, if anything, does electability have to do with it? Is there a desire on the part of the majority of Americans to elect a woman? If so, why? Or is it just because we've not had one? Is there a good enough reason? Is gender parity a good enough reason? And so these are questions, but the rhetoric of Hillary Clinton's bid was fascinating. Her slogan was, "I'm in and I'm in to win." And I know why she said that, because often when women run for president, the press casts them as vice presidential hopefuls. It has happened to other women before. And so she wanted to make clear that she was going for the top job. And she said that with one of her slogans. Okay, so more than 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, I gave a TEDx PSU talk, and I shared a survey that I gave students, 500 students from across the country. And I asked them if the bids of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin made them believe that a woman is more likely to become president than previous to 2008. And the results were very strong. Almost 90% said yes. So that gives us a little bit of a clue that when we see women running for political office, more women are encouraged and more women believe that a woman could be president. You know the saying, seeing is believing. So in 2020, boy, we saw a lot of women, right? It was the most. I couldn't even believe it myself when it was happening, because woman after woman was coming out and saying, I'm running for president. Well, of course, it was the largest group of people ever, but we hit the critical mass. We hit 20% because researchers Witt and Paget did a study that said, we will have gender parity in presidential politics when we have a critical mass of women running. We hit it in 2020. There were 6 women. So 6 of the 30 overall presidential candidates, of course, the largest ever in United States presidential history. So who were these women? I'm going to refresh your memory if you forgot. So at the top, you see Tulsi Gabbard. She's the youngest woman who ran. At the time, she was a Hawaiian congresswoman. She brought a lot of Hawaiian culture to her bid. Sometimes she wore the lei of her home state, and she was a peace-promoting war veteran. You know, that captures a little bit of her bid. Below her, you see Kirsten Gillibrand. Kirsten Gillibrand is a senator from New York, and she's a strong advocate for women's rights. She replaced Hillary Clinton in the Senate, and she is dubbed the Me Too senator. And a lot of her rhetoric centers around women's rights, and she speaks a lot about how she is often treated because she is a woman on the campaign trail, how often her appearance is described by the press, which is one of the drawbacks many women face. In this collage, you see Marianne Williamson. Marianne Williamson was in her bid for the presidency of the United States in 2020. She is an author of a lot of self-help type books, and she was trying to create deep change. She took a historical approach and a spiritual approach. And of all the women featured in this book, she was the only one who gave me an interview. So I'm very grateful to her for that. But she was quite bitter that her framing of the way the country needs to respond to deep hate with deep love was made fun of when she was a presidential candidate. And she doesn't think that if she was a man, it would be made fun of. For example, you know, she cited President Biden's quote, "the soul of America," she said was so close to what she was talking about, which was, you know, we have to love each other more. We have to fight for deep change. So also featured here are Amy Klobuchar. She's a Minnesota senator, very successful, winning senator in Minnesota in a very red state. She continues to represent a senator. Her narratives as presidential candidate were very pragmatic, middle class, results oriented, passed more bills than other senators. And then, of course, we all remember Elizabeth Warren. She was a professor turned political candidate, and she was fighting for the middle class. And I can still hear her rhetoric in my head about how, you know, it's easy for the top CEOs who are making millions, you know, but it's not so easy if you're a middle class family. A lot of her rhetoric drew upon her own lived experiences as a young woman who grew up in a family where her father lost his job and her mother had to go out to get a job, and what a change that was for her family. Now, we know that Kamala Harris, who made a presidential bid in 2020, was then invited on the ticket with Joe Biden to be the vice presidential candidate. She was raised by a single mom, grew up in Oakland, California during the civil rights unrest, and she often, you know, talked about what that was like for her as a young woman growing up in that situation. Now, when I say when women run, women win, we can point to Kamala Harris. There is absolutely zero doubt that she would be vice president of the United States today if she did not run for president. And previous to her, we had Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin. And that was the closest a woman had ever gotten to the presidency, unless we look at secretaries of state who have a lot of presidential, you know, leadership power and visibility. So, you know, other notables, as I wind it down here today, you'll recognize some of these people that you'll see on the screen: Ferraro and Palin, Jorgensen, Victoria Woodhull, and these are important women who've made bids, but we often forget about their bids because they're not constantly in the press, and they kind of like slip from our memory. So in 2020, when we had 6 women in the presidential race, did it change the rhetoric of women in presidential politics? Well, it's very hard to measure whether it has changed it, but the perceptions of presidential politics, we saw a lot of merchandise come out. My vice president looks like me. Someone sent me a pin that said "first but not the last" about Kamala Harris. And, it's the power of representation. It's the trailblazers who have come before us that make us think that it's possible. And so seeing it is believing it. And so these are some of the books I've published over the years that tackle this question. And, I'd like to think that in a small way, even publishing the books helps to, remind us about the women who have run for president. So I look forward to taking some of your questions today. And I thank you so much for your interest in the topic and my presentation.
All right, thanks, Nikki. We have a couple questions that have already come through. And let's start with Amy's question. How does media images of women in presidential roles, and I think she's referring to maybe in kind of local pop culture, Gina Davis in Commander-in-Chief, Robin Wright in House of Cards, how does that support or disadvantage a future female president?
Every research is such a good question. Every research study I've read about this say that it is, yes, Amy, thank you for the great question, say that it definitely supports the future election. Because again, it's rhetorical. It's being able to see a woman, even if it's fictional. So during the pandemic, I got into Scandal. I had never seen Scandal previous to that. For whatever reason, didn't watch it. But people said, "Oh, I think you like that show, Scandal." So I thought, okay, I have some time on my hands now. I'm going to watch it. I blew through it, started writing about it, but it had, a first lady turned president is one of the plot lines. And I do think that shows like that show a woman, I think the second part of Amy's question was, what if she's not good, or what if she does something terrible? Does that mean bad things for a woman leader? I actually don't think so. But I mean, I don't think there's any studies that, talk about what if she's not an effective leader, does that hurt? I think that old adage, any press is good press, is good when we can see a woman in a leadership position, even if it's a parody. I'm sure you remember Amy Poehler and Tina Fey in their interpretations of Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. It just added more interest to the women who are running. So it was a really good question. Maybe we'll get a new drama that has a woman who is president, because I do think there's interest. I do.
So Mary Louise and Sanford ask similar questions. Why has the United States been so slow to elect a female president when so many other democracies worldwide have already done so?
I think there are two main reasons. I think that in some other countries, and again, I'm going to give the caveat, I'm not a political scientist, but I think there are parliamentary systems that require gender parity. They just make sure that there's 50% of women who are running. But I also think the other reason is there's a German researcher, Hofstede, and he studies masculinity and femininity of cultures. And the United States is high on the masculinity list. And I think, our local congresswoman, Susan Wild, answered this question well. I thought, I had a student do an honors project not long ago. And she asked her, she said, why don't you think there are as many women in political office in the United States as there are in other countries? And she said, we still are a country that is suspicious of female leadership. It just isn't used to seeing it. We don't have it, but, we broke the barrier at Penn State. So, let's hope that, the way Penn State goes, so goes the country. I do think that women as university presidents also make a difference in that the rhetoric of women leaders, and I do think it helps us to visualize a person who is female in that high office in a way that we just can't unless it's in front of us. And so there are some countries that have so many women. Some of the Scandinavian countries are practically run completely by women. And we've seen very effective leadership. I think about New Zealand's president, Jacinda Ardern, who, brought her child to the United Nations for a meeting, and was very effective in her strategy surrounding the coronavirus. I think that we recently saw the passing of the Queen Elizabeth, and there was a lot of discussion about what did she do for women leaders globally. And I think even though that's a ceremonial position, I still think that, again, the rhetoric of it, the idea that you had this woman who was just the top person that everyone bowed to. And there's a photograph of Queen Elizabeth, who's 25, just receiving the crown, and Winston Churchill is bowing to her. And I think, that's a powerful rhetorical image. And when we see more of those images, I do think that inches along our perceptions of what a woman can do and how a woman could lead.
Another question from Margaret. How are women especially suited to be the commander-in-chief?
Well, I thought that's a great question. And there are some studies about that too. And some of the studies indicate that women's historical needing to take care of families and the multitasking component of many women's lives lend itself. But I think there are also men, that can do the same thing. And we don't know because we haven't elected a woman president yet. But, there are some criticisms about research that suggests that women leaders would provide more support for social services. But there are studies that suggest that, like things like daycare and maternity leave, because women have experienced these challenges. We noticed during the pandemic that it was more women who walked away from their professions because it became too hard for them to help their children learn at school, at home, as well as hold down a job. So we would think that there would be a lot of compassion for those things, but I'm not saying a man can't have those things either, that a man is not compassionate. So we'll find out, and it's not monolithic. We may have a woman president who doesn't have compassion for those things, but there are studies that suggest that the ways that we'll see differences include more social services. I think about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and I'll give you an example. When the coronavirus hit, she was seated on her child's bed in her child's bedroom, and she held up like a little bunny rabbit toy. And she said, don't worry, children of New Zealand. The bunny rabbit, he can still come around and provide you with treats during Easter, even though the virus is around, and I thought, that was a very maternal leadership message. I'm not sure I ever heard a message like that. Another image pops in my mind, and that is, does everybody remember that image of John Kennedy when he was president? He was sitting at the Resolute desk, and little John was underneath playing. And I know that when Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady, she very carefully curated the photographs that appeared. It's pre-social media, so there were very few photos, and they were released in a very careful way into the public. Sometimes I wonder if that was a woman president sitting at the desk and a little child was playing underneath, what the story would be that the media tells about that. Would it be, where's the nanny? How can Madam President get her job done if her child's crawling? Or, is that a safe place for the baby to play? Would there be more criticism because we live in just this hypercritical society? But we've seen these kinds of questions about whether a woman can lead if she has children have surfaced when photos would be released of, say, someone running for political office who has young children. So I think we don't know how she will, be any different. But I think some of these like family issues, I think it would help us imagine that a woman could have, support to be in a position like that.
Another great question coming in from Anne Maria Colum. She wants to know, what is missing from the public discourse that still limits the acceptance of women leading at the Oval Office? Is it men not accepting women as a woman as a leader, or is it women not validating or supporting a woman leader?
Great question. Just because a woman's running doesn't mean that women are going to vote for that woman. And we've seen that in past elections. The other thing I would say is that lots of things help this. So whenever we have a woman who's in a leadership position and she's very effective, and we could think of some women in the United States who have been at the top, and they haven't been president, but maybe they've been Secretary of State and they've been very effective, or they've been very visible. I think that when we're very careful about media coverage, I think it helps women in the future, because we don't want to describe women as too frivolous, or we don't want to describe their clothing, and I think that some women who have run for political office have figured out ways to present themselves that draw less attention to their physical appearance. And I'm going to give you an example. Kamala Harris appeared on the cover of Vogue. I think it was either Vogue or Vanity Fair. And in one photograph, she had her sneakers on, because she likes to wear Chuck's sneakers. And there was a lot of public outcry that wasn't a very dignified way to show the Vice President of the United States. So the magazine reissued the magazine virtually, a virtual cover, and showed her more formally dressed. And it sounds like a frivolous thing, but I think that often men who are running for political office can be photographed very naturally and casually. But women have to be a little more careful, because they are already under scrutiny for being maybe not qualified for the job. And I think we saw this a little bit with Liz Truss. Now, I don't think she stepped down because of her gender, but when she was first elected, a lot of the rhetoric surrounding her was, is she up for the job? And I'm wondering if that would be the same if she were not female, if she were a male candidate. So I think it is partly the media's responsibility to cover women in a way that doesn't call attention to their clothing. Another example, our current First Lady, Jill Biden, she will not discuss what she's wearing. So while she has to put a lot of time and attention into many clothing changes in order to fulfill her duties as First Lady, she told the press, don't even ask me what the designer is or why I chose it or anything like, because I'm not going to talk about my clothes. I think that helps. I think, the fact that she kept her paid employment as a college professor shows that she's an independent person who has work outside of being First Lady. And I think even though First Lady is not an elected official, it is a powerful position for a woman in the United States. I also think it'll be interesting to see when we do elect a woman president, what the first gentleman does as first gentleman. Is he going to take on a lot of the ceremonial kinds of jobs, like choosing the china, preparing for state dinners? Will he leave his paid employment? That's, an interesting question.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us today and for your presentation. I also want to thank all who have tuned in to today's virtual speaker session. As a reminder, you can see a full listing of Alumni Association events on our website at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thank you all for joining us and for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are
Penn State.